right, this is it. Today is the big day. We are putting the fluids in right now, and as soon as the fluids are in and all the levels are checked, we're gonna be giving this thing its first start in almost 6 months. Now, it sat that long because honestly, right as it started acting up, I was on vacation, I had a bunch of stuff at work, so it did sit for several months before I actually started this project. So don't think that if you have to do this job, it's gonna take you 6 months. It's not that bad, but it is a very exciting day when I'm adding fluids and ready to put some power to it. So first things first is oil. Now this thing is bone dry. We've had the pan off for a long time. And, well, let me rephrase that. Bone dry is wrong because we did lubricate all of the rotating assemblies and things like that. However, it has been very, very, very thoroughly drained. So I've cleaned up this funnel here, and we're gonna drop that in there. Now, they basically say if you're just doing the oil, it's like something like 6.3 quarts. If you're doing oil and filter, it's basically 7.5 quarts. I'm probably gonna need even more than that just because of the sheer amount that has come out of this motor. So I'm gonna start with 7 quarts, dip it, see if we've made the stick, and then we'll top up from there. And I'm using Mobil 1 full synthetic, and I am using 5W30. If you live in a colder climate than me, you definitely wanna do some research to see what the best oil for you is. Here in Florida, this should be perfect. It is not a super high mileage engine, but it does have some miles on it, so I went slightly thicker. The thinnest it suggests is 520. I honestly think that's a little too thin, even for almost a brand new one of these. So we're doing 530, and that should be perfectly fine. Also, Mobil 1, sponsor me. This car stuff's expensive. Now, for a lot of you guys who've been following the channel for a while, you probably noticed on this build, I haven't been filming as much of the actual physical hands-on work as we usually do in other videos, and there is a reason for that. In the last handful of months, my brother and I have both been extremely busy and on somewhat opposite schedules. And it's very, very difficult to film yourself doing a project without a second set of hands. So I'm doing my best here just to at least get us back on track as far as, you know, filming and showing you guys what we're actually doing. So thank you guys for bearing with us, because I know there's been a lot of movie magic scenes where it's just like, boom, now the thing is done, and you didn't get to see us do it. But when I'm underneath the car and I'm juggling a wrench and a rag and a, you know, every other thing you can imagine, it is very challenging to also add a camera into that mix. So yeah, once again, thank you so much for your patience. I know that side of things has definitely diminished, but we're gonna put our first 5 quarts in here, which is this big jug. And you know, we know it'll take all of this no trouble. So just going, you know, quick, but not dumping it in maximum speed. We definitely don't want this to flood out all over the valve cover here. But we are almost done with this first jug, and then we're gonna do another 2 quarts out of the next 5-gallon jug that I have. All right. Now normally I'm actually kind of pretty frugal, and I will actually stand these things upside down, let the oil. Now if you want a testament to just how little oil was actually in this engine, I just poured 5 quarts into this thing. You just watched me do that. And then I had the moment of realization that I didn't put the oil filter on. And I looked under the car expecting to see an absolute waterfall of oil, and not a drop came out. So thankfully, put some oil inside of that filter and threaded that on, just in case it was still running its way down there. And it went on with no issue. So 2 things we're gonna touch on. When doing an oil filter, it's always best to try and pre-fill it at least a little bit before you put it on. Mine mounts sideways. That's a worst case scenario as far as pre-filling the filter. But even then, you can usually fill it to just a little less than halfway. And make sure that, like, you'll watch, it'll absorb into the element. So, you know, top it up until that's happened. And then also take a teeny bit of oil, rub it around the gasket that's on that filter too, just to make sure it doesn't seize when you're putting it on. It'll make sure you get a really nice, good seal. I usually crank my filters down as hard as I physically can by hand, using both hands, and that's usually tight enough. So I used a Purolator 1 filter, and I'll see if I can get you guys the part number here in a moment. Here we go. So for the Jag, that would be your PL15317. And you know, Purolator makes a good product, so I feel pretty good about that. So now we're gonna add our last 2 quarts up here, and I say last, our next 2 quarts, and then we're gonna dip it and see where we've got to. And of course, if you are uncertain when you're using these big jugs, they do have measurement indicators on the side here to show your oil level. So basically, You know, this side here is the quarts, this is the liters. So I'm gonna add 2 quarts. And let me just check it on a flat surface here. Yeah, excellent. So for me, that's getting us just under this line right here. Let's see how we're looking. That was about 1. And again, this thing should take bare minimum 7.5. So I'm already being overly cautious by stopping at 7. But, you know, again, it's a lot easier to add more than it is to try and take some away. So I'm gonna do just a little more because it's just not quite at 7. All right, something like that should put us basically at about 7 quarts. So now we're gonna dip this thing. Let me get a clean cloth here. Should have one of these on hand. All right. First time I've pulled this dipstick and expected to actually see oil on it in a while. Let's see. It had oil on it. That's a good start, but it could just be from the initial fill. Would you look at that? We are actually halfway up the measurement right there. So that's a great start. Honestly, about 1/2 quart, and it'll put us right to the top of where we need to be. So I'm gonna add just a little bit more, and obviously after the first start and everything's moved around, there's a good chance we'll even have to add a little more again because it'll fully grabbed onto all the surfaces and it'll be more at like its operating level. But that is an awesome, awesome start. We actually see it, aren't you glad? Stopped at 7 quarts there just to see what would happen. So I'm gonna go add, like I said, maybe just under 1/2 quart here. And I think we're gonna call that good for the first start. So next up is the Supercharger oil. Now this is something I haven't actually done with the blower in the car before. Last time I did the Supercharger oil, I did it on my bench at home. This time around, I decided to actually get the blower installed because we were waiting on that RTV to dry. I just now had plenty of cure time, so it should be all good. But it is time to now fill the blower in the car. And here is where it gets interesting. That little guy right there is our fill port. So it is reachable, but it is not as easy to access as it would be with this out of the car. So I'm gonna grab our little hex wrench, which if I remember rightly, I think was a 7/16, and I'm gonna pull that plug. And filling this is real straightforward. So you wanna use a good supercharger oil. So I either suggest using GM's supercharger oil, or if you happen to have purchased stuff from Powerhouse Performance like I have, they provide you with this really good stuff too. So I'm gonna be using the Powerhouse Performance stuff, but if you haven't, you can always buy the General Motors product and it is good stuff. All right, we popped our little plug out here and I was incorrect, it is 3/16, that's what it is. So this little guy right here does the trick. And I'm actually going to disconnect this little coolant hose because I have the luxury of doing that because there's no coolant in the car right now. So I'm gonna pop this off and that'll clear a little space up here. I'm also gonna pull this harness back a little too, just to give us some extra room to get down there. Now, as you can imagine, we're not gonna be able to just pour straight out of a bottle into a horizontal hole. So we're gonna use a small funnel and a little bit of a tube and basically poke that tube in the hole right there, and we're gonna fill that way. And the beautiful thing about this procedure is it's real straightforward. There's no measuring a specific amount or anything like that. You literally fill that area of the blower up until basically just the oil starts to weep out of the fill hole. So basically as soon as you hit that, that is the perfect level. You just wipe off any excess oil that has dripped out of the front and you put that plug back in and you are done. All right, so I've wedged a rag underneath as far as I can, just in case, we know a little bit of oil is gonna weep out. So I've made sure to tuck that just as far under the blower as it'll possibly go. And I'll show you the little setup I've made to fill this thing with oil. And look at this high-tech piece of science that we have right here. So basically, the reason for the foil tape is because we had to slightly modify the funnel. We basically snipped the actual little bottom of the funnel and kind of curled it over itself to make it small enough to fit inside this hose. This was the only decent sized hose we had, and this was the smallest funnel we had. So it did seat in nicely. The foil tape is just to make sure that that funnel doesn't just pop out while we're filling. That's just to hold it mechanically in place. So I'm gonna put this end of the hose in the hole in there, and we're gonna start putting blower oil in. All right, so sorry for the funny camera angle, but I am standing in a position where I can see the bottom of the weep hole in the blower, and I'm gonna hold the funnel. I'm gonna pitch the camera up a little bit, come to think of it, because I have to hold the funnel a little bit higher to make sure I have a constant downward motion with the oil. And basically, I'm gonna just ever so slowly add the oil until I see it just start to weep out of that hole. So we're gonna do that now. And fingers crossed our little funnel contraption doesn't leak. And there is merit to not consistently pouring because a lot of fluid will be in this line. So if you're constantly pouring and then you see it come out of that weep hole, even if you stop pouring, all the stuff in this line is going to go in there. So you want to just pour and then stop, and then pour and then stop. And that way, you know, hopefully you can minimize how much of it actually comes out. So I'm not going to make you watch this whole thing. I'm going to repeat that procedure you just saw me doing a few more times, and we should be good to go. So meanwhile, James has been helping me top up the coolant on this. So basically, he's been adding coolant to the main reservoir. We're using the Prestone for GM vehicles, which is the orange Dexcool stuff. That is what you're supposed to use with these. Of course, if your car is currently running green coolant, do not mix the two. Just stick with the green coolant unless you plan on doing a full and thorough flush. But for us, we were running orange coolant this whole time. We're sticking with orange coolant because that is what the manufacturer recommends. So while that's all been happening, we did manage to get this filled. You can see we just had a little bit drip out of there. And I've wiped up that area. I'm gonna put the plug in now, and then we'll pull this rag. All right, we are good to go, literally. We've got enough coolant in here now to just seal those two up. So we're gonna put the top plug back in, and we're gonna put that guy in there. The coolant level will drop a little once it's started, but there's enough in there at least to run. And we are basically ready for our first start. We're gonna reconnect the battery and see what happens. What do you guys think? This a cool angle for a first start? All right, so we did the initial start with both of these open, and after running for a minute, we started to get some coolant bubbling up out of here, which is a good sign. So we've just wiped that up and put this cap on now. And as you'd imagine, this reservoir emptied real quick, but James is gonna start it now. And you know, second start, hopefully easier than the first. Definitely has a blower. All right, so that is a huge milestone. The car did start, had a bit of a high idle. I realized there was one connector I had not connected on the throttle body, but as soon as we connected that back up and started the car again, the idle was nominal. It was right about 600, 650 RPM, which is right where it used to be. It does have a hint of a miss, but it came in with that, and I think that's more like a coil or something along those lines, so we can start to chase those down, but the car runs. And as you can see, for the first time in a long time, we have put the hood back on. So hood is real easy. It's just 3 bolts on the hinges here. You can see we've lined it back up with the marks on the hood. And on the driver's side here, you've got your grounding strap that goes to this guy here. And then these literally just clip back on, and they just, once they're snapped on, they're on. So this is basically as far as we're gonna get for tonight. There's a couple little leaks on some of these hard plastic hoses. So I'm gonna work on tracking these down and seeing if it's something I can maybe purchase a new one. Specifically the guy that kicks from here to there. You can see we got rags on both ends. A little bit annoying, but those are leaking. So we're gonna see if we can fix that. Tomorrow, once the car is fully cooled down, we're gonna top the coolant up and we're gonna do the proper coolant bleed procedure. All right, we're back for another day with the Jag, and we are doing the little details to wrap this thing up. Most notably, we're gonna be addressing the coolant leak from the hard plastic hose that runs from here to there. And we're gonna be seeing if we can identify and address the little misfire that it has that seems to be causing just a little bit of a rough idle. But first, it's lunchtime, and you know what that means. It's not lunch at Low Tech without a chili dog. All right, now that was a satisfying lunch. Checkers, just saying, if you want to sponsor me, man, I'll be the best chili dog advocate you've ever had. So while wolfing those down, I did a bit of research, and I managed to find a replacement hose for the one that is leaking. That is excellent news. Not wildly expensive either. I located it on Parts Geek, and I'll try and include the part number as well for you. I think the part itself was 18 bucks. I think I ended up paying $32 total, including shipping and shipping insurance, because honestly, it's a hard plastic hose. Shipping it could be kind of weird, and I could just see it getting damaged in transit. So for the extra $2.50, I figured why not pay for the insurance. Now, the good news is a new one of those should solve that problem. That one worked several times. I've had it on and off multiple times, and I think finally it just gave up. You know, I think I probably wore out the O-rings. And actually, no, I know it's not the O-rings. It's the connection between the snap connector and the hard line itself. If you don't feel like spending that money, you can actually take a rubber hose and basically slot that over the hard line and use hose clamps. I would suggest if you do that, maybe trying to heat up the plastic and maybe put like some needle nose pliers in the end to create a little bit of a flare just so you get a better seal. But for me, I figured 30 bucks, get an OEM part, it'll look factory, makes the most sense. One of my other hard lines was giving me a little trouble, the one that has the straight connector as well, where it basically goes through the firewall, or sorry, the radiator support, and connects into the intercooler. The extra tension that's being put on it by that sitting farther forward, it basically was pulling the connector apart just a little bit, and it was starting to weep a little bit. So I looked that up to see, hey, how much does it cost to get a replacement one with maybe a little better O-ring? That's not as forgiving. That one I found at about $70, and the hose that it connects to, I think was $40. So you're talking, after shipping and everything, it's $130. So I didn't buy those ones. I have instead come up with a little solution, which I'll show you here in a moment. So back out here in the garage, I've kind of looked this over, and I think the logical next step is actually to try and get the front bumper on. So really, I need to do that before I can get like the inner fender liners back in place, before I can get the wheels on. And of course, you know, I can still do the service with making sure that the miss in the engine and stuff like that is addressed as well, so it's not too hard. And the bumper, which has been lovingly stored over here this whole time, should be relatively straightforward. If you remember, it's just those two big bolts. So I'm gonna take a second and clean some of the dust and stuff that you see on that top lip off. Gonna get these little inlet tubes off and kind of ready to roll, because that's kind of its own little assembly deal as we put that in. And then hopefully heft this thing into place. Now, obviously, I am not trying to clean the whole bumper. I can do that with it installed on the car, but I do want to get these little challenging to reach places where this basically tucks under the headlight assembly. So I've got my favorite tool here, and I'm just going to try and gently work some of this dirt and dust off. And thankfully, as you might predict, because it is literally just dust that's a little bit sticky, but nothing too bad, it is coming right up with minimal effort. I'm barely using any pressure at all. I'm just letting the water do its thing. My goodness, that looks really good. I am so excited to give this car its first bath in months. And thankfully, with the ceramic coating that's on it from Resurrection Auto, who you should check out, it should come up real nice and clean. This dust really does not stick to this thing at all. So as you can see, that looks really good. And again, it's important to get those areas that you normally can't reach when you have the opportunity. So I'm going to cross over and do the other side there, and we're ready to get this thing hefted up and on. So you might remember these guys from earlier. These are the bumper mounts, and basically it's a pretty straightforward design. Again, you can actually adjust the height of your bumper by rotating this in and out, so you can actually ever so slightly tweak it. So if yours happens to have a crooked front bumper where one side is lower than the other, it's actually very straightforward to fix that. Now, mine was always good, and I've left these basically exactly where they were. So I'm just giving this a wipe down here, and then essentially this opening right here is where each of these go, and up through that bottom hole is where the big bolt goes, and there's a thread up here that it bolts into. So I'm gonna heft this thing into place, and we are gonna get it back installed, hopefully in a matter of minutes. One thing that I realized I probably forgot to mention is this little guy right here. Genuinely, I actually don't know what this does, but it came off the car, I left it connected, and I put it right back on. So I believe it just tucks behind the bracket here, and this bolt goes through it, so that's how I've got it attached. And now we're gonna get the bumper back on. So I've just hefted it up into place, but as a reminder, you also have 2 locating tabs on the sides here. So basically, we want this bracket right here, this metal plate, to slot into the hooks on the bumper. So you're gonna have to make sure that both sides line up, and then you should be able to seat it backwards. And there we have it. After a little bit of wiggling it around, we managed to get both sides seated in, and the bumper slid straight back. So now the only remaining pieces for the bumper itself are the 2 large bolts that go up from underneath, the air vents that go for the brakes, and then reconnecting the fog lights. And those bolts go right up in here. Now I couldn't track down my 18 mil, but this 3/4 seems to be doing just fine. So if you're in a pinch, it'll do. There we go. And I don't think there's much of a torque spec on that one. So we're just doing it nice and tight. Now back under here, we don't have to worry about these air dams. And you'll notice this one is actually hanging in place. I had 1 clip broken on this side and it was bothering me. So I actually routed a zip tie through it to hold it so it actually seats properly. It actually feeds the brakes the way it's supposed to. So that's why this one is staying on, whereas the other one doesn't. The clips are all perfect on that side. And it's probably overkill to do the zip tie thing, but it was just, I didn't like that it wasn't supported at the bottom. So that being said, we have our fog light plug right here. We're gonna plug this guy back in, which I think just goes that way. There we go. So fog light is good on that side. We go around the other side and do the same thing. Then, before we get to doing the wheel liners and everything like that, I'm gonna come in here and just wipe everything I possibly can down. This will be my last chance to clean some of these components. And over time, they'll get dirty again, but it'll just make me feel better knowing that they're nice and... All right, so without scrubbing this thing with soapy water, this is as good as it's gonna get. You'll notice that I have moved the inner fender liner back in place, so I swung it forward. We've got some plastic body plugs to put in, but first things first, we're actually gonna put the underbody tray on, the one that goes on the underside of the bumper, and that's using these guys right here. All right, with that in place, we're gonna move on to securing the inner fender liners. So basically, we got those plastic plugs, one here, one there, and one down to the bottom that you can sort of see there. Okay, and as you can see, we have our body plugs in and holding this in place, so we are looking good. Now, I've also lifted the air dam up and clipped the inner shield in place. So this is now suspended between the fender well here and the front bumper. If you have the issue where the clips have broken off on the front bumper, you can either use a zip tie connection to the front bumper to hold it in place, or I've seen you can zip tie right here as well. The one thing you don't want to do is leave that loose, because you can actually lose this inner piece, and they're a little expensive to replace. So if yours is loose, that air dam is not supported on the front bumper, you should definitely consider pinning this in place. All right, so that's some big progress for today. We have the front bumper in, we figured out the hose, which is on the way to us, so that'll resolve the one coolant leak we've got going on. We're gonna circle back and do the misfire another day. We're also gonna get the grille and headlight surrounds in another day as well, but big progress today. And if this video has been engaging to you so far, definitely hit that like button. And if you've watched more than one of these, I keep saying it, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, please. If you keep hearing me saying this and you haven't checked to see if you're subscribed, go check right now. You may not even realize you're not. So go hit that subscribe button, and hopefully you'll be ready to go when you see our next video come out. This thing should be down on its wheels in no time.